Hello again, and welcome back to Mild History. Tonight, as we settle into another long journey through the past, I invite you to take a moment for yourself. Perhaps you are resting in your favorite chair, perhaps already lying in bed. Some of you might be listening with a cup of tea, or with headphones as you drift slowly towards sleep. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it for you? I always find it fascinating that these quiet stories can reach across time zones, across continents, and find listeners in so many different corners of the world. Feel free to let me know in the comments below. It's a small reminder that while we're separated by distance, we're also gathered together in this shared curiosity about history. Now, let us dim the noise of the present and step quietly back into the world of Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt, as Rome saw her. For centuries, Cleopatra's story has been wrapped not in the plain cloth of truth, but in the embroidered fabric of myth. When most people hear her name, an image immediately forms: a queen reclining on a golden couch, dressed in silk, her eyes lined with kohl, her lips curved in a smile that promises secrets. She is surrounded by luxury, incense, jewels, servants fanning her with palm leaves. At her side, powerful men, Caesar, Antony, are caught in her spell, unable to resist. This is the Cleopatra most of us know. But this Cleopatra is not truly Cleopatra. The figure that has come down to us was shaped by the pens of Roman writers, men who were her political enemies. To them, she was not just a queen of Egypt. She was a threat to Rome itself. And so they painted her as something dangerous, something unnatural, a foreign temptress who could topple generals and unravel empires not through strategy, but through seduction. The Roman poet Horace, writing not long after her death, described her as a fatale monstrum, a fatal monster. Others went further, making her the embodiment of excess, decadence, and immorality. In their stories, her power was not earned through wisdom or ability, but granted by beauty and guile. This, of course, was useful, for if Cleopatra could be dismissed as a temptress, then the great defeats of men like Antony could be explained away. They were not failures of Roman strength, but the result of feminine trickery. It was a comforting story for Rome, but not a true one. The power of storytelling. We must pause here because it is important to remember something. In the ancient world, the way someone was remembered was often more powerful than the truth of their actions. There were no cameras, no recordings, no way to capture the living Cleopatra. What survived were words written mostly by her enemies. The Romans knew this power well. They believed that history could be shaped through narrative, and so they told the story that suited them. And the story that suited them was of Cleopatra as the foreign queen who ensnared Roman men. Even writers who admitted her intelligence could not resist framing her through this lens. The historian Plutarch, writing more than a century later, said that Cleopatra's beauty was not in itself extraordinary, but that her conversation and presence were irresistible. In other words, even when praising her intellect and charm, he still couched it in terms of seduction. Cleopatra in art and drama. This image of Cleopatra did not remain only in Roman histories. It was carried forward, century after century, into art, literature, and eventually film. In the Renaissance, when European artists rediscovered classical texts, they also rediscovered Cleopatra. Painters depicted her as the archetypal femme fatale, reclining, half-clothed, surrounded by riches, often in the dramatic moment of her death by the bite of the asp. Shakespeare, too, could not resist her. In his play Antony and Cleopatra, she is not simply a queen but a force of passion. Age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety. To Shakespeare's audience, Cleopatra was thrilling and dangerous, a woman who could move a Roman general to throw away his duty for love. Later, in the modern era, this myth took on new life in cinema. Hollywood gave us Cleopatras clad in glittering costumes, Elizabeth Taylor's portrayal being perhaps the most famous. The queen was presented less as a politician and more as a vision of exotic beauty, dazzling and destructive. And so, from Rome to Shakespeare to Hollywood, Cleopatra was made into something she was not, a legend of seduction rather than a strategist of survival. But why has this myth endured for so long? Why do we still picture Cleopatra this way, more than 2,000 years later? Part of the answer lies in gender. A woman who ruled, who held power in her own right, was deeply unsettling to the men who wrote her story. It was easier and more comfortable to reduce her to her relationships with men than to admit her political genius. Another part lies in the human love of stories. The tale of a beautiful queen who bewitched the mightiest men of Rome is simple, dramatic, and memorable. The reality, that she was a skilled ruler navigating impossible politics, is more complex, less easy to paint in broad strokes. And yet, if we look carefully, we can begin to see the real Cleopatra hidden beneath the myth. A glimpse beneath the veil. Imagine her not as the reclining temptress, but as a young woman of 18, suddenly made Queen of Egypt in a world where Rome's shadow loomed large. Imagine her not surrounded by jewels, but by advisors, generals, priests, all questioning her, testing her, watching to see if she could hold power. Imagine her voice, speaking in Greek to her court, in Egyptian to her people, switching languages with ease. Imagine her in ceremony, not merely dressed for beauty, but clothed in the robes of Isis, presenting herself as divine, eternal, chosen. This is the Cleopatra that history too often forgets. A queen not of seduction, but of, with care. As we close this first part of our journey tonight, we leave Cleopatra still shrouded in myth, but already the outlines of the truth are emerging. She was not the creature of Roman slander, nor the shimmering goddess of Hollywood fantasy. She was something far more interesting, a woman who mastered the art of survival in an age dominated by men and empires. In our next part, we will step deeper into her world, into the Egypt she inherited, a kingdom of wealth and danger, of splendor and fragility. To understand Cleopatra, we must first understand the throne on which she sat, and the challenges that faced her from the very beginning. So take a breath, perhaps adjust your blanket, and let us pause here. We will continue shortly with the story of Egypt in the age of Cleopatra. Egypt at the time of Cleopatra. When we think of Cleopatra, it is easy to picture her as a singular figure, the lone queen, standing in brilliance against the tides of history. But no ruler exists in isolation. To truly understand Cleopatra, we must first understand the Egypt she inherited, the land, the people, the dynasty, and the challenges that weighed upon her from the very beginning. Tonight, then, we step into the world of Egypt in the 1st century before Christ, a land of splendor and fragility, of wealth and decline, poised on the edge of greatness and collapse. A land of ancient splendor. Egypt, by the time of Cleopatra's birth, was already ancient beyond imagination. More than 2,000 years had passed since the great pyramids of Giza had risen on the desert sands. Dynasties had come and gone. Pharaohs had ruled and faded into history. The temples of Luxor and Karnak, the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, these were not new wonders, but monuments from a distant past, even to the people of Cleopatra's age. And yet, Egypt remained a land of wealth. The Nile still flowed, as it always had, bringing life to the desert. Each year, its floodwaters nourished the soil, and from that soil came grain, the foundation of Egyptian prosperity. To the wider Mediterranean world, Egypt was the breadbasket, a kingdom whose harvests could feed armies, cities, and empires. But wealth, as always, brought envy, and Egypt's position made it vulnerable. By the 1st century BCE, the great powers surrounding it, Rome to the west, Parthia to the east, looked upon Egypt with hungry eyes. The Ptolemaic dynasty. Cleopatra was not the first of her name. She was Cleopatra VII, the last in a long line of rulers from the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Ptolemies were not native Egyptians. They were Greeks, descended from Ptolemy I, a general of Alexander the Great. When Alexander died in 323 BCE, his empire was divided among his commanders. Ptolemy claimed Egypt, and from that moment on, his descendants ruled as pharaohs. For nearly 3 centuries, the Ptolemies governed Egypt, blending Greek and Egyptian traditions. They spoke Greek at court, built libraries and theaters, and celebrated Greek culture. But they also adopted the titles and rituals of the old pharaohs, presenting themselves as divine rulers in the Egyptian style. This mixture was both strength and weakness. It gave the dynasty legitimacy, but it also distanced them from their people. Many Ptolemaic rulers barely spoke Egyptian. They were seen, at times, as outsiders sitting on the throne of the Nile. By the time of Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, the dynasty was weakened. Civil wars, debts, and reliance on Roman power had eroded their authority. Egypt was still rich in resources, but its rulers were dependent, often paying vast sums to Rome to keep their crowns secure. Alexandria, the jewel of the Mediterranean. At the heart of Cleopatra's Egypt was Alexandria, the great city founded by Alexander the Great. It was a city of light, learning, and luxury. Its harbor bustled with ships from across the Mediterranean. Its streets were lined with statues, columns, and palaces. And at its center stood the great library, a treasure house of knowledge said to contain hundreds of thousands of scrolls. To live in Alexandria was to be at the crossroads of cultures. Greek scholars, Egyptian priests, Jewish philosophers, and merchants from as far as India mingled in its markets and academies. It was cosmopolitan, ambitious, and proud. But Alexandria was also a city of stark contrasts. The wealthy elite lived in marble homes, surrounded by gardens and servants. The poor crowded into narrow streets and struggled for survival. It was here that Cleopatra was raised, in a palace overlooking both splendor and poverty. Cleopatra's childhood and education. Cleopatra was born in 69 BCE, a princess of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Unlike many of her ancestors, she received a remarkable education. The Ptolemies valued learning, and Cleopatra was tutored in philosophy, mathematics, rhetoric, and astronomy. She read Homer, studied law, and learned the art of persuasion. Most extraordinary of all, she studied languages. It is said that Cleopatra could speak as many as 9 tongues: Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, Aramaic, and others from neighboring lands. In this, she was unique among her family. Most Ptolemies had never bothered to learn Egyptian, ruling instead as foreign kings. Cleopatra, by contrast, embraced it. She presented herself not just as a Greek monarch, but as a pharaoh of Egypt, bridging the gap between ruler and ruled. This skill would serve her well, for in diplomacy, language is power. The ability to speak directly to foreign envoys, to priests, to merchants, without the need for interpreters, gave Cleopatra an authority her predecessors lacked. A kingdom in decline. Yet for all its splendor, Egypt at this time was in decline. The Nile still flowed, the fields still bore grain, but the kingdom was politically fragile. Her father, Ptolemy XII, was a weak ruler. He spent lavishly, drained the treasury, and relied heavily on Rome to keep his throne. To secure Roman support, he paid enormous sums, plunging Egypt into debt. His reign was unstable, marked by revolts and unrest. For young Cleopatra, this instability was the world she grew up in. She saw firsthand how fragile power could be. She watched as her father was forced into exile, then restored by Roman intervention. She learned that survival depended not only on ruling Egypt, but on managing the ambitions of Rome. By the time she ascended the throne in 51 BCE, she was already prepared for the delicate balancing act that lay ahead. The challenges of a young queen. Cleopatra became queen at the age of 18. She shared the throne, at least in name, with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. In practice, it was a dangerous arrangement. Sibling rivalries were common in the Ptolemaic dynasty and often ended in bloodshed. She inherited a kingdom facing famine, unrest, and crushing debts. To make matters worse, Rome was growing ever more powerful, its generals vying for dominance across the Mediterranean. Egypt was a prize too tempting to ignore. For Cleopatra, the challenge was immense. How to preserve Egypt's independence in the face of Rome's rising power, and how to maintain her throne in a dynasty notorious for family intrigue. It is in this world, fragile, precarious, and yet filled with opportunity, that Cleopatra's story truly begins. And so, as we close this second part of our journey, we leave Cleopatra standing at the threshold of power. She is young, educated, ambitious, and already aware of the dangers that surround her. The Egypt she rules is ancient and glorious, but also weakened and vulnerable. Its wealth is great, but its independence fragile. Rome's shadow looms, her family's loyalty is uncertain, and the people's trust must be earned. In our next chapter, we will see how Cleopatra responded to these challenges, not as the temptress of Roman imagination, but as a strategist and politician. We will watch her step into the throne room, the temple, and the streets, carefully shaping her image as a queen not only of Egypt, but of the gods themselves. So let us pause here, take a breath, and prepare to continue. When we return, Cleopatra will no longer be the princess of a troubled dynasty, but the ruler of a kingdom caught between survival and collapse. Cleopatra was no longer just a young queen seated on an unstable throne. She was a ruler in her own right, and from the very beginning she understood something that many before her had not. Power was not only a matter of armies and treasuries, it was also a matter of image, of ritual, and of the stories people told about their ruler. When Cleopatra stepped into the role of queen, she inherited not just a kingdom in crisis, but a dynasty whose legitimacy had always been fragile. Her ancestors, the Ptolemies, were Greeks who had ruled over an Egyptian population for nearly 3 centuries. They had taken Egypt as the spoils of conquest, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals. For all their outward titles and crowns, they were still outsiders. Many of them had never even bothered to learn the Egyptian language. To their subjects, they were distant monarchs in marble palaces, Greek rulers masquerading as pharaohs. Cleopatra saw this weakness, and unlike her predecessors, she made a different choice. She would be more than a foreign queen perched on the throne of the Nile. She would become a true pharaoh, a ruler who lived within the traditions of Egypt, not above them. From her earliest public appearances, Cleopatra presented herself as the living image of Isis, the Egyptian goddess of motherhood, fertility, and kingship. When she walked in ceremony, when she stood in the temple courts, when she was carved into stone reliefs or pressed into silver coins, she appeared not merely as Cleopatra, but as Isis reborn. To her people, Isis was eternal, a protector, a mother, a divine force who watched over Egypt. By associating herself so closely with the goddess, Cleopatra gave herself a sacred legitimacy that no Roman army and no rival sibling could ever erase. Imagine the scene in Alexandria. The wide ceremonial avenue lined with crowds, priests in their linen robes carrying statues of the gods, the air heavy with the scent of incense. Musicians played flutes and tambourines, their rhythms echoing across the marble colonnades. And there, carried in a golden litter, was Cleopatra. Her robe shimmered in the sun, her crown glistened, and around her neck lay the symbols of Isis. To the people gazing up at her, she was not only queen, she was divine presence. In the eyes of the crowd, to oppose Cleopatra was to oppose the goddess herself. This was no accident of vanity. It was statecraft. Cleopatra knew that loyalty could not be commanded by force alone. It had to be inspired, cultivated, nurtured. The devotion of her people would not come from armies in the field, but from the sense that she was more than mortal. And yet, Cleopatra's genius lay in her flexibility. To the Egyptians, she was Isis, the divine mother. To the Greeks of Alexandria, she was a cultured monarch, patron of philosophy and the arts, fluent in Homer and Plato, versed in rhetoric and mathematics. To Roman envoys, she was regal, intelligent, and commanding, speaking their language without hesitation, treating them not as superiors but as equals. She could be many things at once, always shifting her image to fit her audience, always aware of what they needed to see in her. Her command of language made this possible. Unlike her ancestors, who often relied on translators, Cleopatra learned Egyptian and many other tongues. Some sources claim she spoke 9 languages fluently. Whether the number is exact or exaggerated, the point remains. Cleopatra could address almost anyone directly. Priests, merchants, scholars, and soldiers, she could speak to them without an interpreter. This gave her an authority that none of her predecessors had. A speech from her lips was not a message filtered through another's voice. It was immediate, direct, and powerful. Language was more than communication. It was intimacy. It allowed Cleopatra to break down the barriers that had long separated the Ptolemies from their people. It allowed her to stand not as a foreign monarch, but as one of them. In a dynasty so often seen as distant and aloof, this was a radical act. Her political reality, though, was not shaped only by rituals and ceremonies. It was sharpened by danger. The Ptolemaic court was a nest of intrigue. Brothers and sisters turned on one another. Husbands and wives poisoned each other. Cousins schemed, advisors betrayed, generals changed sides. Cleopatra herself had to share the throne, at least on paper, with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. Their co-rule quickly turned into rivalry. Cleopatra had the loyalty of some factions, but others preferred her brother. When tensions boiled over, she was forced to flee Alexandria. Imagine the humiliation. The young queen, barely 20 years old, slipping away from her own capital, her throne occupied by her sibling and his allies. For many rulers, this would have been the end. But for Cleopatra, exile was not defeat. It was a pause. She gathered loyal supporters. She built her case, and she waited for her chance. That chance came when Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt. His presence was not by design, but by circumstance. He came in pursuit of his rival Pompey, who had fled to Egypt after losing the Roman Civil War. Pompey was murdered by Cleopatra's brother's advisors in a misguided attempt to please Caesar. But instead of gratitude, Caesar was outraged. He established himself in Alexandria, and suddenly Egypt was host to the most powerful man in Rome. Cleopatra recognized at once what this meant. This was the opportunity she had been waiting for. If she could secure Caesar's support, she could retake her throne. The difficulty was in reaching him, for her brother's faction controlled the city. And so came the famous story. Cleopatra, barred from Caesar's palace, arranged to be smuggled inside. Some say she was rolled in a carpet. Others say she was carried in a linen sack. However it happened, the effect was the same. Caesar, the most powerful man in the world, was surprised by the sudden appearance of the young queen before him. This was not seduction. This was strategy. Cleopatra had risked her life to place herself directly before Caesar, to speak with him face to face, without intermediaries, without delay. The gamble worked. Caesar supported her claim. War broke out between Cleopatra's forces and those of her brother. The fighting was brutal, and Alexandria itself suffered. But in the end, Cleopatra prevailed. Ptolemy XIII was defeated and drowned in the Nile. Cleopatra was restored to her throne, this time with Caesar's backing. From the outside, Roman propaganda insisted that Cleopatra had bewitched Caesar, that she had seduced him. But the reality is more complex. Cleopatra had not merely fluttered her eyelashes and captured his heart. She had read the situation, seized the opportunity, and taken decisive action. She had played the game of power and won. With Caesar's support, she secured her throne. She bore him a child, Caesarion, who symbolized the union of Egypt and Rome. To the Egyptians, he was heir to the pharaohs. To Rome, he was the son of Caesar himself. For Cleopatra, this was not romance, it was dynastic strategy. Her child was a living political statement. Coins minted after her restoration reveal how carefully she shaped her image. Unlike the soft, idealized portraits of Roman matrons, Cleopatra's features were rendered strong and sharp. Her nose prominent, her chin firm, her eyes direct. These were not the features of a delicate beauty, but of a ruler. To her people, the message was clear. Here was a queen who was not ornamental but authoritative, a sovereign in her own right. From this point onward, Cleopatra's political reality was set. She could not defeat Rome militarily. No Egyptian army could rival the legions. Instead, she would wield the weapons she had mastered: image, language, ceremony, and diplomacy. She would make herself indispensable, irreplaceable, undeniable. She would ensure that Egypt's independence survived not through conquest but through strategy. This was not the Cleopatra of Roman slander, nor the Cleopatra of Shakespearean passion. This was Cleopatra the ruler, practical, intelligent, adaptable. A queen who knew that her survival, and the survival of Egypt, depended on her ability to turn perception into power. As we close this chapter, Cleopatra stands restored to her throne, her enemies defeated, her son born, and her position secured. She has faced exile, civil war, and betrayal, and yet she has emerged stronger than before. She is no longer the uncertain young queen of 18. She is a sovereign who has proven her skill. In the next part of our journey, we will see how Cleopatra expanded these strategies. We will witness how she used her children as pawns in diplomacy, how she staged ceremonies that bound her people to her, and how she projected her image not only across Egypt but across the Mediterranean. We will see her soft power in action, as she turned myth into reality and reality into authority. So let us pause here, take a breath, and prepare to continue. The Queen of Egypt has claimed her throne, and now she will show the world how a woman can rule not through armies alone, but through the subtler and far more enduring power of perception. Cleopatra had secured her throne, survived civil war, and aligned herself with Rome's greatest general. Yet her story was far from over. Egypt remained fragile, and Rome's power only grew stronger with each passing year. Cleopatra understood that military might alone could not protect her kingdom. Instead, she leaned ever more deeply into a form of power less obvious, but no less effective: soft power. In our modern world, the term soft power refers to influence through culture, persuasion, and image rather than through force. In the 1st century before Christ, Cleopatra wielded it with unmatched brilliance. Her reign became a masterclass in how to transform perception into authority, how to make symbols as powerful as swords, and how to turn ceremonies into acts of statecraft. Every public act, every ritual, every coin struck in her name became part of this strategy. To understand her reign is to see not just the battles fought with steel, but the victories won with spectacle, story, and subtlety. Imagine the streets of Alexandria during a royal procession. The air is heavy with incense, banners ripple in the sea breeze, and priests chant hymns in Egyptian as the crowd gathers. Then comes the queen, borne aloft in a gilded litter, dressed in the flowing robes of Isis. Gold catches the sunlight, jewels sparkle, and all eyes turn toward her. This is not mere pageantry. It is politics in its purest form. For every man, woman, and child watching, the sight confirms what they already believe, or what she wants them to believe. that Cleopatra is more than a ruler. She is divine. She is chosen. She is eternal. This fusion of politics and religion was one of her greatest tools. Egypt's people had always seen their pharaohs as divine, living gods on earth. By claiming the mantle of Isis, Cleopatra reaffirmed that tradition, binding her authority not to Rome, not to dynastic squabbles, but to the sacred order of the universe. But Cleopatra's soft power extended far beyond the processional streets of her capital. She used her children as instruments of diplomacy. Each child was a symbol, a living embodiment of an alliance. Caesarion, the son she bore with Julius Caesar, was declared King of Kings. To the Egyptians, he represented continuity, the next generation of pharaohs. To Rome, he was the living link between Egypt and Caesar himself. Later, her children with Mark Antony would be granted kingdoms and titles, weaving them into the grand tapestry of Mediterranean politics. These children were not merely heirs. They were pawns, carefully positioned on the board of power, each one strengthening her hand. Her mastery of image also appeared in the coins she minted. Unlike Roman women, who were often shown with idealized, softened features, Cleopatra allowed her coins to bear her likeness with strength and sharpness intact. Her nose was prominent, her chin firm, her gaze direct. These were not the traits of a delicate beauty, but of authority. When a merchant held one of her coins, when a soldier received his pay in silver marked with her face, he did not see ornament. He saw command. Coins traveled further than speeches. They carried her image across borders, into markets, into distant hands. Each one was a silent ambassador of her power. In her court, Cleopatra also cultivated a sense of sophistication and culture. She welcomed scholars, philosophers, and scientists, continuing Alexandria's tradition as a center of learning. But this too was political. To be seen as the patron of knowledge elevated her beyond the role of mere monarch. It made her a cultural figure, a symbol of refinement and wisdom. Rome valued power, but it also admired learning. By embodying both, Cleopatra set herself apart. We must remember that soft power is not only about what is shown, but about what is felt. Ancient sources speak of Cleopatra's extraordinary ability to make her presence unforgettable. Plutarch wrote that her beauty was not overwhelming on its own, but that her conversation, her voice, her manner, made her irresistible. We must be careful not to read this through Rome's lens of seduction. What Plutarch was observing was charisma, the ability to command a room, to make each person feel as though they were in the presence of something greater than themselves. Imagine entering her audience chamber. The air is cool, perfumed faintly with oils. The walls gleam with painted reliefs of gods and kings. At the far end sits Cleopatra, her eyes steady, her posture poised, her every gesture deliberate. When she speaks, she shifts effortlessly between Greek, Egyptian, or Latin, depending on who stands before her. She does not merely speak to you. She envelopes you in the gravity of her presence. By the time you leave, you are convinced, not by logic alone, but by the force of her being. This too was soft power, not conquest but persuasion, not threat but influence, and she extended it across borders. Through envoys, through trade, through culture, Cleopatra projected Egypt's image into the Mediterranean. Her alliances with Rome were not simply forged in private chambers, but reinforced through spectacle. When she sailed to meet Mark Antony at Tarsus, she arrived not as a supplicant, but as a goddess. Ancient accounts describe her ship with purple sails, silver oars, and musicians playing as if Aphrodite herself had descended. Antony, waiting on the shore, was compelled not by a lover's whim, but by a politician's realization. This woman carried with her the aura of divinity, and to align with her was to share in that power. In all of this, Cleopatra demonstrated a profound truth: that power is not only about armies and swords, but about perception and belief. A queen who could convince her people she was divine, who could show Rome she was indispensable, who could weave her image into every coin, every ritual, every child born to her. That queen wielded a power as real as any legion. As this chapter of her story unfolds, we begin to see why Rome feared her, and why later generations reduced her to myth. For to admit that Cleopatra ruled not through beauty, but through brilliance, was to admit that a woman could be as formidable a statesman as any man. And so, as we pause here, Cleopatra stands at the height of her influence. She has turned symbols into weapons, children into diplomats, and rituals into instruments of survival. She has shown that soft power, wielded with precision, can be as sharp as any sword. In the next part of our journey, we will see how this strategy drew her ever deeper into Rome's world. we will watch as her alliances with Caesar and Antony brought her not only glory, but peril. For while soft power could elevate her, it could not shield her forever from the hard edge of Roman ambition. So let us rest here, with Cleopatra at her zenith, a queen whose throne was built not only on stone and grain, but on the invisible architecture of belief. Cleopatra had mastered the tools of soft power. She had presented herself as Isis reborn, a queen of ceremony, a mother of dynastic heirs, and a ruler whose image traveled on every coin. Yet for all her brilliance, she knew that Egypt could not exist in isolation. The greatest force of her age, the shadow that fell across the entire Mediterranean, was Rome. Rome was not yet an empire, but it was becoming one. Its armies marched across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Its generals fought not only foreign enemies, but each other, each man seeking to dominate the Republic. To Cleopatra, Rome was both danger and opportunity. Danger, because its hunger for wealth and grain could easily swallow Egypt. Opportunity, because the rivalries within Rome meant that alliances could be struck and support one if she played her part carefully. Cleopatra's political reality was bound to Rome's reality. To understand her reign, we must step briefly into the Roman world she confronted. At the time of Cleopatra's rise, Rome was divided. Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Marcus Licinius Crassus had once formed an uneasy alliance, the so-called First Triumvirate. But ambition is not easily shared. Crassus was killed in battle, and Caesar and Pompey turned against one another. Civil war erupted. It was during this war that Pompey fled to Egypt, seeking refuge. He hoped that the Ptolemaic dynasty, indebted to him for past favors, would welcome him. Instead, the advisors of Cleopatra's brother, Ptolemy XIII, murdered Pompey on the shore, presenting his severed head to Caesar as a gift. They believed they had done Caesar a favor. In truth, they had horrified him. Caesar wept when he saw the head of his old ally, and in his fury, he turned his gaze upon Egypt. It was in this storm that Cleopatra acted. Exiled from Alexandria by her brother's faction, she saw in Caesar her chance to return. The story of how she entered his presence has been told for centuries. Smuggled into the palace, rolled in a carpet, or perhaps hidden in a linen sack. However it happened, the moment was daring. Cleopatra did not wait for Caesar to summon her. She placed herself before him, face to face, knowing that this single meeting could determine her future. What Caesar saw was not simply a young woman, but a queen. She spoke with intelligence, with confidence, with the poise of someone who had already endured exile and rebellion. She offered not only her presence, but her partnership. Align with her, she argued, and Egypt would be stable, loyal, and useful. Caesar agreed. War broke out between the factions. Cleopatra's brother was defeated, drowned in the Nile. She returned to the throne, this time with Rome's greatest general at her side. To many, the story was simple. Cleopatra had seduced Caesar. But beneath the myth, the truth is plain. She had assessed the situation, taken a risk, and won. From this alliance came a child, Ptolemy XV, known as Caesarion. To Cleopatra, his birth was a triumph. He was not only her son, but the son of Caesar, the most powerful man in Rome. In him, she saw the possibility of a new dynasty, one that could bind Egypt and Rome together. She called him King of Kings, a title that proclaimed him heir not only to pharaohs but to empires. For the Romans, however, Caesarion was a threat. If Caesar had acknowledged him, if the child of Cleopatra and Caesar were ever recognized in Rome, it could upend the delicate balance of power. Caesar's enemies whispered about it, and though Caesar himself never declared Caesarion his heir, the very existence of the boy sent ripples through the Roman world. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, Cleopatra's position grew precarious once again. The man who had secured her throne was gone, stabbed by senators on the Ides of March. Rome plunged once more into civil war, this time between the assassins, Brutus and Cassius, and Caesar's supporters. Among those supporters were Mark Antony and Octavian, the young grandnephew whom Caesar had adopted as his son. Cleopatra watched carefully. Egypt could not ignore this struggle, but nor could she throw herself blindly into it. She bided her time, weighing her options. Then, in 41 BCE, Mark Antony summoned her to meet him in the city of Tarsus. It is here that we encounter one of the most famous scenes of Cleopatra's life. Ancient sources describe how she sailed up the river Cydnus to meet Antony, not in a simple galley, but in a spectacle. Her ship had purple sails that billowed in the wind, silver oars that caught the sun, and musicians playing as if the goddess Aphrodite herself had descended upon the waters. Cleopatra sat beneath a canopy, dressed as the goddess, attended by servants as if they were nymphs. To the onlookers, it was a vision. To Antony, it was irresistible. Not because he was weak or foolish, but because he understood the message. Cleopatra was showing him not merely her wealth, but her power. She arrived not as a supplicant begging for aid, but as an equal, a sovereign whose presence demanded respect. From that moment, Cleopatra and Antony were bound together. Their relationship has often been described in terms of romance, and no doubt there was passion between them. But beneath the passion lay politics. Antony needed Egypt's wealth to fund his wars in the east. Cleopatra needed Antony's protection to keep Rome at bay. Together, they formed a partnership that was as strategic as it was personal. For several years, their bond held. Cleopatra bore him 3 children: Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus. Each child was another piece on the chessboard of power, granted kingdoms and titles that spread Cleopatra's influence beyond Egypt. In Alexandria, Antony and Cleopatra lived as rulers of the East, holding court in splendor, presenting themselves as a new dynasty. But in Rome, this alliance caused outrage. To many Romans, Antony appeared to have abandoned his duty, ensnared by a foreign queen. Stories spread of drunken banquets, of Antony dressed as a god, of Cleopatra enthroned beside him as Isis. The reality was more complex. These ceremonies were not indulgence but propaganda. Yet the Romans saw only betrayal. At the heart of this tension was Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, who would later become Augustus. Octavian despised Antony, but he despised Cleopatra even more. He saw in her not only a foreign rival but a symbol of everything Rome feared: a woman who wielded power, a queen who claimed divinity, a monarch who could threaten Rome's supremacy. It was Octavian who spread the most enduring myths about Cleopatra. It was Octavian who painted her as a temptress, a corrupter of Antony, a woman who led him astray from his Roman duty. By doing so, he weakened Antony's reputation and justified his own coming war against them both. And so we see Cleopatra at the height of her entanglement with Rome. She had aligned herself with Caesar, then with Antony, not as a lover chasing passion, but as a queen ensuring survival. Each alliance was calculated, each relationship a shield against Rome's might. Yet in those very alliances lay the seeds of danger. For by binding herself so closely to Rome's great men, she made herself the target of Rome's enmity. As we pause here, Cleopatra stands in splendor in Alexandria, her children around her, her partner Antony by her side. Together, they present themselves as rulers of the East, masters of kingdoms, heirs to gods. But across the sea in Rome, Octavian sharpens his knives, both of rumor and of steel. In the next part of our journey, we will see how this rivalry came to its climax, the war that would end with the fall of Antony and Cleopatra and the final eclipse of Egypt's independence. So take a breath, rest a moment, and prepare to step into the twilight of Cleopatra's reign, where myth and reality intertwine for the last time. Cleopatra's reign had reached its pinnacle. She had weathered storms of family betrayal, exile, Roman interference, and shifting alliances. By the mid-30s BCE, she stood as the undisputed queen of Egypt, her throne secure, her children placed into positions of dynastic promise, her partner and ally Mark Antony at her side. Together they ruled from Alexandria, the jewel of the Mediterranean world. It was a city of marble palaces, libraries filled with scrolls, bustling harbors that brought in spices, silks, grain, and gold. In its streets, Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and Roman voices mingled. The queen's image adorned temples and coins, her presence felt in every ceremony, every festival, every judgment passed in the royal courts. To the people of Egypt, Cleopatra was Isis reborn, the living goddess who cared for her land and her children. To her allies in the East, she was a sovereign of vision and authority. To Antony, she was not merely a companion, but a co-ruler, a partner in empire. Their children together, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, were granted titles and territories that suggested a new dynasty rising in the East, an empire that might rival Rome itself. And yet, for all this brilliance, shadows lengthened across the horizon. In Rome, Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and heir, was gathering his strength. He was not flamboyant like Antony, not charismatic, not loved by soldiers in the way Antony was. But Octavian possessed something deadlier: patience, calculation, and a ruthless clarity of purpose. To him, Antony was no longer just a rival in politics. Antony had become, in the public imagination that Octavian carefully cultivated, a Roman who had betrayed Rome itself. And at the center of that betrayal was Cleopatra. Octavian knew the power of stories. Long before swords clashed, he began his war with words. He spread tales of Antony and Cleopatra feasting in drunken revels, of Antony abandoning Roman virtues to live as Cleopatra's consort, dressing as Dionysus, playing the part of a god rather than a Roman statesman. He told the Roman people that Antony no longer served their republic, but a foreign queen. And Cleopatra herself became his sharpest weapon of propaganda. She was no longer depicted as a capable monarch or even a woman. In Octavian's words, she was a sorceress, a temptress, a corrupter of men. She had bewitched Antony, drained his strength, and turned him against his own people. This narrative, repeated again and again, struck deep into the Roman imagination. It played upon fears of the East, of luxury and decadence, of powerful women, of the loss of discipline that Rome prized above all else. Cleopatra understood this, and she knew the danger. She had not only to defend her throne and her children, but also to fight an enemy who had already convinced much of Rome that she was the embodiment of its nightmares. The stage was set for the final confrontation. It would come not in the sands of Egypt, but upon the waters of Greece, at a place called Actium. In the summer of 31 BCE, Antony and Cleopatra brought their forces together. A grand fleet of warships, rows of infantry, cavalry, and auxiliaries drawn from their territories. They gathered in Greece, seeking to face Octavian before his strength could overwhelm them. Cleopatra contributed not only ships but also the vast wealth of Egypt, grain to feed soldiers, gold to pay mercenaries, supplies to keep armies moving. Their fleet was magnificent. Cleopatra's ships were large, ornate, built not only for war but also as a statement of power. Their sails gleamed in the sun, their prows carved with symbols of gods and kings. Antony's confidence remained strong. He believed he could still match Octavian, defeat him, and restore his honor in Rome. But Octavian had a weapon Antony could not match, his admiral Agrippa. Skilled, disciplined, relentless, Agrippa understood the sea as Antony never had. His ships were smaller, swifter, easier to maneuver. He harassed Antony's forces, cutting off supplies, disrupting communication, forcing Antony into a war of endurance rather than decisive battle. Weeks turned to months. Disease crept through Antony's camp. Food dwindled. Morale sank. Soldiers began to doubt. Officers began to whisper. Cleopatra, ever pragmatic, saw that time was not their ally. She urged Antony to act, to strike, before their strength dissolved entirely. And so, on the 2nd of September, 31 BCE, the fleets clashed in the waters of Actium. Imagine it. The morning mist rising from the Ionian Sea, the sound of drums beating to keep the oars in rhythm, the cries of sailors, the blare of trumpets. Cleopatra's ships, heavy with soldiers and supplies, rode into position. Antony's lines stretched wide, hoping to encircle Agrippa's smaller fleet. Octavian's forces, disciplined and compact, waited with patience. The battle raged for hours. Ships rammed against ships, oars splintered, sails caught fire. Men leapt from deck to deck, swords flashing in the smoke. The sea itself became a battlefield of chaos, thick with wreckage and blood. In the midst of this turmoil, Cleopatra made her move. With her fleet endangered, perhaps recognizing the tide of battle turning against them, she sailed through the lines and fled southward. Whether this was prearranged or desperate is still debated, but Antony, seeing her departure, abandoned his command and followed. To his enemies, this was proof of all Octavian had claimed. Antony bewitched, Antony forsaking duty for Cleopatra. The reality may have been more complex. Perhaps it was a planned retreat, an attempt to preserve their core strength. Perhaps it was loyalty to the queen who had risked all for him. But perception mattered more than truth. And in the eyes of the world, Actium was not a battle, it was a collapse. From that moment, Antony and Cleopatra's fortunes unraveled swiftly. Their surviving forces drifted away, defecting to Octavian. Cities that once pledged loyalty now surrendered without resistance. The image of Antony as a great Roman general was shattered. Cleopatra, once seen as a sovereign of power, was cast in Roman eyes as the ruin of one of their greatest men. Back in Alexandria, the atmosphere shifted. The city remained splendid, its palaces glowing in the sun, its harbors still filled with goods. But beneath the surface, anxiety rippled. People whispered of Rome's advance, of Octavian's victories, of allies who had once sent envoys now sending apologies to Octavian instead. Yet Cleopatra did not collapse into despair. She had faced reversals before. She fortified Alexandria, stockpiled supplies, and prepared her fleet for one last defense. She sent envoys to negotiate with Octavian, offering tribute, even offering to step aside if her children could be spared. But Octavian, by now calling himself the savior of Rome, had no interest in compromise. He wanted total victory. He wanted Egypt. Antony, meanwhile, struggled with despair. The Antony of earlier years, the man who had marched with Caesar, who had been beloved by soldiers, who had commanded legions with ease, was gone. In his place was a man haunted by failure, by shame, by the loss of honor. He still loved Cleopatra, still stood beside her, but the burden of defeat weighed heavily upon him. In their final months together, Antony and Cleopatra staged one last act of defiance. In Alexandria, they held the so-called Donations of Alexandria, a grand ceremony where their children were proclaimed rulers of kingdoms yet unconquered. Alexander Helios was declared king of Armenia and Media. Cleopatra Selene was crowned queen of Cyrenaica and Libya. Ptolemy Philadelphus received Syria and Cilicia. Caesar Ion, her firstborn by Julius Caesar, was proclaimed king of kings. It was a pageant of hope, a dazzling performance meant to show that their vision of empire still breathed. But to their enemies, it was further proof of arrogance. To Octavian, it was a provocation, Cleopatra daring to proclaim her son the heir of Caesar, threatening Octavian's own claim as Caesar's adopted heir. In the summer of 30 BCE, Octavian marched on Egypt. His armies crossed the deserts, his fleet approached the Nile. Alexandria trembled. Antony tried to rally his men, but defections spread. His last loyal forces were crushed. When word reached him that Cleopatra had taken refuge in her mausoleum and that she was dead, Antony could bear no more. He fell upon his own sword. Wounded but not killed, he was carried to Cleopatra. There, in the half-lit chambers of her mausoleum, he died in her arms. Their story, so often retold as romance, was in truth a tragedy of politics and power, of two figures caught in the jaws of Rome's relentless rise. Cleopatra, now alone, faced her conqueror. Octavian entered Alexandria in triumph. The Queen of Egypt, once radiant upon her gilded barge, stood now surrounded by soldiers. Octavian did not order her execution. Instead, he planned to drag her back to Rome, to display her in chains as the centerpiece of his triumph. But Cleopatra, who had shaped her image so carefully, who had wielded ceremony as power, would not allow her final act to be humiliation. She resolved to die as a queen. The manner of her death remains one of history's great mysteries. Ancient accounts speak of an asp, smuggled in a basket of figs, its venom delivering a swift and regal end. Others suggest a vial of poison hidden in her robes, or a poisoned comb pressed into her skin. However it was done, the truth is the same. Cleopatra chose her death. She robbed Octavian of his spectacle, denied him the triumph he had prepared, and preserved her dignity. When Octavian entered her chamber, he found her lifeless body adorned in royal dress, her crown upon her head, two loyal handmaidens at her side. She had staged her death as carefully as she had staged her life, the final ceremony of a queen who had never surrendered her image to another's control. With her death, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended. Caesar Ion, her son by Julius Caesar, was captured and killed, a boy of 17 struck down to eliminate any threat to Octavian's claim. Her younger children, those she bore to Antony, were spared. They were taken to Rome, raised in the household of Octavia, Antony's former wife and Octavian's sister. Their futures were quiet, their destinies far from thrones. Egypt itself became a province of Rome, its grain ships feeding the empire, its temples and treasures flowing into Roman coffers. Octavian, soon to be known as Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, had triumphed. And yet, Cleopatra was not erased. In Rome, poets and historians would retell her story as Octavian wished: the dangerous queen, the seductress, the foreign witch. In time, Shakespeare would take up her tale, turning her into a figure of passion and doom. Painters, playwrights, filmmakers would recreate her in image after image, sometimes as goddess, sometimes as harlot, sometimes as tragic lover. But beneath the layers of myth, the reality endures. Cleopatra was not simply a temptress, nor merely the lover of two Roman men. She was a queen of immense intelligence, a master of language, ritual, and diplomacy. She ruled for over 20 years in a time when kingdoms fell like leaves in the wind. She faced the greatest empire of her age, and though she lost, she shaped her destiny until her final breath. As we leave this chapter of her life, let us pause to reflect. Cleopatra lost her throne, but not her dignity. She lost her kingdom, but not her legend. She lost the war, but in history, she won a kind of immortality that Octavian, for all his power, could never take away. Her death marked the end of an age. The Mediterranean was now Rome's sea. Egypt, once the land of pharaohs and pyramids, became another jewel in the crown of empire. Yet the memory of Cleopatra, the woman who stood against Rome, who shaped her image like a weapon, who died on her own terms, lives on, her shadow stretching across centuries. And so, as night settles, we close this chapter in quiet reflection. A queen has fallen, but a story remains, a story that has never ceased to capture the human imagination. Cleopatra's death in the summer of 30 BCE marked the end of more than her own life. It marked the end of a dynasty, the end of Egypt's independence, and the end of a story that had stretched back to the time of Alexander the Great. Yet even as her body lay lifeless in her mausoleum, her presence refused to fade. Her enemies had conquered her city, seized her treasures, and claimed her throne, but they could not extinguish her memory. In death, Cleopatra began her second life, her life as legend. In the days after her passing, Octavian, who would soon call himself Augustus, wasted no time in shaping that legend. For him, Cleopatra had been an enemy queen, a dangerous figure who had dared to stand against Rome. He knew that if he allowed her to be remembered as a sovereign who fought to the end, or as a mother who sacrificed herself with dignity, her story might inspire sympathy or admiration. That was not acceptable. Octavian needed her death to magnify his triumph. He had not simply defeated Antony, he had saved Rome from corruption. He had not merely taken Egypt, he had destroyed the woman who had bewitched one of Rome's greatest generals. So the narrative began to shift, and it shifted quickly. Cleopatra was no longer remembered as the careful strategist who had preserved her throne through 2 decades of turmoil. She was no longer the queen who had spoken a dozen languages, who had ruled with ceremony, diplomacy, and intelligence. In Roman accounts, she became a temptress, a sorceress, a foreign woman who had ensnared Antony with passion and led him to ruin. This version of her story fit neatly into Roman anxieties about power, gender, and the East. Antony could be excused for his failings if they were the result of enchantment. Rome could be excused for destroying Egypt if Egypt had been ruled by a dangerous, corrupting woman. And Octavian could be glorified as the man who had saved Rome from her spell. While propaganda reshaped Cleopatra's memory in Rome, her children still lived, though their fates diverged sharply. Caesarion, her eldest son, the child she had borne to Julius Caesar, was 17 when Octavian's men captured him. He had been sent away, perhaps toward India, in a desperate attempt to preserve him from Rome's vengeance. But promises of safety lured him back, and in Octavian's eyes, he represented the single greatest threat to his new position. Caesarion was the natural son of Julius Caesar, and in a world where bloodline carried immense weight, his very existence undermined Octavian's claim as Caesar's heir. Octavian ordered him killed. The words attributed to him, "Too many Caesars is not good," speak of his ruthlessness, but also of his fear. With Caesarion's death, the last hope of a direct continuation of Cleopatra's dynasty was extinguished. Her younger children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, born to Antony, were treated differently. They were paraded in Octavian's triumphal procession in Rome, dressed in golden chains, walking behind the victor as symbols of Egypt's defeat. For Cleopatra, who had staged every ceremony of her reign to preserve her image and dignity, this would have been unbearable to imagine. Yet even this humiliation did not end their lives. Octavian handed them into the care of Octavia, his sister and Antony's former wife. Under her protection, the children grew up quietly in Rome, far removed from crowns and the intrigues of power. Of them, Cleopatra Selene's life is the best known. She was married to Juba II of Mauritania, a learned and loyal client king of Rome, and together they ruled a North African kingdom. Through her, Cleopatra's bloodline endured, though far from the Nile. Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus fade from history's record, their lives likely cut short, their stories unrecorded. Meanwhile, Egypt itself underwent transformation. For 3 centuries, it had been ruled by the Ptolemaic dynasty, descendants of Alexander's general Ptolemy. Now it became a province of Rome. But Augustus treated Egypt differently than other conquered lands. Its wealth, especially its grain, was too vital to Rome's survival. Egypt became the emperor's personal possession, governed not by senators but by equestrians, men of lower rank whose loyalty to Augustus was unquestioned. Senators were forbidden to enter Egypt without the emperor's permission, lest they try to seize the province's riches for themselves. In this way, Egypt became both treasure and trophy, a jewel Augustus kept close to his heart. Obelisks were carried from Egypt to Rome, rising in the forums and circuses as emblems of imperial power. Egyptian gods were absorbed into the Roman pantheon, their images reshaped, their meanings blended with Roman ideas. Yet Egypt's mystique endured. To Romans, it remained a land of mystery, of ancient wisdom, of exotic ritual. And within that mystique, Cleopatra remained an unforgettable figure, her name lingering like incense in the halls of memory. But memory, as always, is shaped by those who tell the tale. The Roman telling of Cleopatra's story was not kind. She was remembered as a seductress, a destroyer, a woman who brought ruin to the men she touched. Ancient historians such as Dio and Plutarch echoed Octavian's narrative, though Plutarch, writing a century later, preserved details that hinted at the truth. He noted that Cleopatra was not the most beautiful of women, yet her presence, her voice, her wit, and her intelligence made her irresistible. He described her ability to adapt, to charm, to speak to each person as if they were the only one in the world. His account, though tinged with Roman suspicion, revealed the qualities that had made her remarkable. Centuries later, Shakespeare took up her story in his play Antony and Cleopatra. His Cleopatra is fiery, passionate, mercurial, capable of grandeur, tenderness, jealousy, and cruelty. She dominates the stage, larger than life, impossible to ignore. Shakespeare's portrait was not history, but it was poetry, and it ensured that Cleopatra would live on in the imagination of the world. Artists painted her death again and again. Sometimes she reclined in splendor, her body adorned in silks and jewels, the asp at her breast delivering its fatal kiss. Sometimes she appeared desperate, surrounded by treasures, her face pale against the richness of her robes. Each painting revealed as much about the society that produced it as it did about Cleopatra herself. In some ages, she was a warning about the dangers of women's power. In others, she was a symbol of exotic allure. In the modern era, her story traveled from canvas to screen. Hollywood, in its grand spectacles, turned her into a glamorous icon, most famously in the 1963 film Cleopatra, where Elizabeth Taylor played her with dazzling costumes and immense presence. That film, like Shakespeare's play, told as much myth as truth, yet it kept her name alive, shaping how millions would imagine her. And through all these retellings, her reality has remained both obscured and luminous. Beneath the myth, Cleopatra emerges not as a seductress defined by the men she loved, but as a queen defined by the empire she fought to protect. She ruled for 2 decades in an age when kingdoms fell like reeds before Rome's scythe. She spoke the languages of her people, presided over rituals, commanded fleets, negotiated with generals, and raised her children as pawns in a game that spanned the known world. She was pragmatic, intelligent, ruthless when necessary, generous when it suited her purpose. She was, above all, a survivor, until survival itself was no longer possible. Her legacy is, in the end, a paradox. By the simplest measure, she failed. Her kingdom fell. Her dynasty ended. Her children were scattered. Egypt became a province of Rome, never again to rise as an independent pharaonic kingdom. And yet, she succeeded in another, stranger way. She became immortal in memory. Her enemies sought to diminish her, but in retelling her story, they ensured she would never be forgotten. Few rulers of antiquity are remembered by name. Fewer still evoke such instant recognition. Caesar, Alexander, Cleopatra, these are names that echo through millennia. And so we ask, who is Cleopatra truly? Was she the seductress of Roman propaganda, the fiery queen of Shakespeare's stage, the glamorous figure of cinema? Or was she the strategist, the diplomat, the last pharaoh who stood against the might of Rome? The truth lies in the space between. She was all of these things, and none of them. She was a woman of flesh and blood, but also a symbol shaped by centuries of retelling. She was, in the end, both history and myth. As we close her story, let us remember the queen who lived at the crossroads of worlds, who fought to preserve her throne with every weapon she had: wit, ceremony, diplomacy, and yes, allure. She lost her crown, but not her dignity. She lost her empire, but not her legend. She lost the war, but she gained immortality of another kind, the immortality of memory. Her throne is gone, her palace is dust, her empire absorbed into another's. But her name endures, her story retold in whispers, in poetry, in paintings, in film, and now in the quiet rhythm of this history. When you next hear Cleopatra's name, think not only of the seductress or the doomed lover. Think of the strategist, the queen, the mother who played the greatest empire of her age at its own game. Think of the woman who stood against Rome, who refused to bend, who chose her death rather than submit to humiliation. She has been many things in memory, but at her core she was one, a ruler who, for 20 years, kept Egypt sovereign against impossible odds. Her life was a tapestry of brilliance and tragedy. Her death was an end, but also a beginning. And her legacy is a reminder that history is not only about victories won, but about stories told. Cleopatra's story has been told and retold for over 2,000 years, and it will be told for 2,000 more. In that, she achieved a kind of victory her conquerors could never imagine. And so, as we step away from the story of Cleopatra, we leave behind more than the tale of a single queen. We leave behind the myth and the propaganda, the romance and the tragedy, and we glimpse, for a moment, the real woman who lived in the midst of it all. She was not only the lover of Caesar or Antony. She was not only the seductress of Roman imagination. She was a strategist, a sovereign, a mother, a queen who shaped her destiny in the face of overwhelming odds. Her empire is gone, her dynasty ended, but her name lives on, whispered across centuries. Thank you for joining me tonight on Mild History. If you found comfort in this slow journey through the past, I invite you to subscribe so that we may continue exploring history's quiet corners together. And I would love to know, where are you watching from tonight? It is always a joy to see how far these stories travel and how many different places are joined together in this moment of calm reflection. Until next time, may your evening be gentle, your rest be deep, and may your history remain mild.